I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This is the third in my series of World War II films that inspired The Last Night to Kill Nazis. So that's the reason we're here, is to promote the release, as we record this next month, of my World War II vampire novel, The Last Night to Kill Nazis. It all takes place on May Day, 1945, the last day of the war, now, look, these two movies that we're going to talk about, they're themed together for many reasons, but one of which is that I said all these movies were ones that kind of inspired the book. I had not seen either Army of Shadows or Five Graves to Cairo in years before I wrote Last Night to Kill Nazis, but they were in the back of my head because the main character of the book, Noah Sanovich, who's a Jewish American OSS agent, some of his backstory that is kind of off screen to me was very influenced by these movies, in a sense. But the theme that unites them is the year 1943, which we'll get to in a second. My guest today, to help me break it down, is my old buddy, historian, librarian, David Woken, who you might recognize if you're a listener of the Dickheads. He joined us on the Moon is a Heart's Mistress coverage, which he said the thing that made me most laugh the hardest on the entire history of the Dickheads podcast. But you're going to have to go back and listen to that episode if you want to hear what it was. I'll just give you a clue. It was a joke involving Stalin.
Wait, I'm not sure if I remember. I think I made one about Lenin.
Lenin. Yes. No, it was Lenin. You're right. It wasn't
I
Stalin.
would not. I would not have said what I said about Stalin. I'll say that. But
okay.
yes.
It was Lenin. You're right.
Yeah.
Wrong Russian leader. However, there's a couple reasons why my old homie David Woken, otherwise known as Evan Dave, was one of my choices to talk about this movie, or became the guest. Is Dave and I have watched a lot of movies together, so we like talking movies together. We were roommates at one time. And one of the things that I love about Dave and his take on movies is that, like me, he likes shitty movies and very good movies and is just as knowledgeable on schlocky crap as
Yep.
he is fine cinema. And so today we're going to be talking about what I consider to be mostly fine cinema with a
Yeah.
little tiny bit of schlockiness involved. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Woken.
Hey. Yeah.
Um,
Neil,
you,
yesterday is a great illustration of what you just said, where I watched the two movies we were going to discuss today, and then followed them with the 1990s direct-to-video classic Uncle Sam.
I have not seen Uncle Sam,
You know,
so
it's the same writer and director as the Maniac Cop series. Larry Cohen wrote it and William Lustig directed. It's not as good as the Maniac Cop movies. Not as entertaining, I think, is maybe the better way to put it. But it's very strong Maniac Cop energy. Imagine Maniac Cop with a dead soldier instead of a dead cop.
there you go. Well,
Yeah.
listen, if we
Anyway,
can talk about Maniac Cop and these films, that is
there you go.
exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Um, well, and that's just it, is that I've always loved the fact that there's certain people who you can watch fine entertainment with, but they're not going to sit down and watch Class of Nukem High with you. And somewhere in between, you got to have friends that will do both. So Yeah, so these movies that we are covering today are The Five Graves to Cairo from 1943 and the 1969 film Army of Shadows. Both of these movies are ones that I saw when I was far too young to get how good they were. And then recently rewatched them for the first time in forever. Army of Shadows I watched a couple months ago, and Five Graves to Cairo I rewatched a couple days ago. So Five Graves is a little more in my head, but
Mm-hmm.
the thematic connection between these movies is the year 1943. Five Graves to Cairo was made in 1943, and the original novel, Army of Shadows, was published in the same year. And Army of Shadows, the book, was, and both of these stories are stories that were written during the war, which is interesting, right? That these stories came out from the time when the end of the war is still speculation, not a foregone conclusion. So that makes them a little different. And the other thing about Army of Shadows, the novel, which I haven't read, but I read a lot about, it's hard to find an English translation of it, was published in Algiers in 1943. So it was the first look that the international community got from a member, Joseph Kessel, who wrote it, was a part of the French resistance. And he was already a novelist, by the way. He published many novels in France and
Mm-hmm.
had to smuggle the book out of the country, which is pretty cool. But we will come back to Army of Shadows in a little bit, because we're going to talk about Five Graves to Cairo. But Mr. Wogan, had you seen either of these movies before?
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, well, no. So Five Graves, I was not aware of before this. But Army of Shadows, I saw. It must have been like so. It was never actually officially released in the U.S. until 2006, and I must have seen it shortly after then. It was definitely late 2000s.
Right.
And I think beyond our movie interests, like I had a deep interest in guerrilla warfare and resistance movements, and so that was one of the reasons I was really keen to watch Army of Shadows because everyone talked about it being a very grounded depiction of the French resistance. Um, which I guess would be one thing we could say about contrasting these movies is how grounded they are. Not that Five Graves is fantastical, but
Yeah.
it's a bit more stagey, a bit more of a classic movie story. Um,
Absolutely. And everyone just got a clue as to one of the other reasons why you were someone I invited to be on this podcast. Um, it's funny too because Army of Shadows on film Twitter got kind of a boost a couple months ago, or well, about half a year ago, when film critic Jacob Hall compared the Star Wars series Andor to a Star Wars version of Army of Shadows, and
yeah,
which I thought was a really interesting comparison. And it was fun to watch film Twitter, a bunch of people on film Twitter go and discover Army of Shadows because it was compared to Star Wars. But hey, we'll take it.
yeah,
So Five Graves to Cairo is a 1943 film, right smack dab in the middle of the war, directed by Billy Wilder, who is one of the most famous screenwriting and film directors ever, with 21 Academy Award nominations, 7 wins in his life. He's won the BAFTA. He's won the big prize at Cannes. He's most well known for movies like Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, um, and of course Double Indemnity, which he would make a year after this, which was really his big break as a film director. With that, and of course, if you don't know that movie, that's the classic noir movie from 1944, like kind of um, groundbreaking and kind of set the stage for noir movies as a whole. Like that's one of
mm-hmm.
the gold standard noir movies. But Billy Wilder is interesting in this case because he fled Germany. He was Austrian and he fled Germany because he was a working screenwriter in Berlin when the Nazis came to power, and he fled. And that's so he has direct experience with hating Nazis and you know being a part of that whole thing.
Yeah,
So
and it's interesting. I've wondered about that, and I wasn't able to dig into it. But also, a lot of the cast playing Germans were actually Germans and Austrians, and I would not be surprised if a lot of them were also folks who were either Jewish or anti-fascist in their politics and had to flee Germany.
right, and it's one reason why the German accents in the move in Five Graves to Cairo are accurate, and actually people are speaking real German in the background,
Hmm.
which in Hollywood movies at the time wasn't always the case. Now, the casting of Rommel is really important. We'll get to that in a minute. Um, but this Five Graves to Cairo is a remake in a sense. It was the third time this story had been told on screen because it's based on a 1917 play called Hotel Imperial, which was a World War I play. I've never seen it, can't really comment on it, but it's my assumption that this play that took place in Europe during World War I, they just kind of took the framework of the story and turned
Hmm.
it into the Five Graves concept, which is which we'll get to the plot in a little bit. But so the main actor who plays Corporal John Bramble is it Franchot Tone is or I believe that's
French show? I don't know. Yeah.
Tone, yeah. Now Cary Grant was Billy Wilder's first choice for this role, but he turned it down. And but Tone was married to Joan Crawford at the time and had been in 7 movies with her. The only thing I recognized him from was from the Twilight Zone episode The Silence. Um, and but he was a working actor in a lot of stuff at the time. His co-star Ann Baxter, who played Mooch, was the title character in All About Eve. It's her most
Mm.
famous role. Again, this role was offered to Ingrid Bergman, who turned it down. Remember, Billy Wilder was not the big name yet that he
Yeah.
would become, so he wasn't getting many of the actors he wanted. But the other really huge casting was Eric von Stroheim as Field Marshal Rommel. This was a big deal because he's quite a character. What do you were you familiar with him before this movie?
I mean, I'm familiar with him as a performer. I didn't really know his biography. I mean, I got a little basics because I just looked up some little bit about the movie. That apparently, as my speculation that a lot of the folks were exiles from Nazism. He was not,
Yeah,
right? He was an Austrian who came to Hollywood in the 20s,
yeah.
um, but yeah, he's a long time famous actor and Hollywood actor, and before that, I think in German silent film too. But I
And
could be wrong about that.
director. And
Oh, and director, right? Yeah.
he directed one of the most act or one of the silent era's most famous and respected movies, a 1924 film called Greed.
Mm.
And I've never seen it, but I watched some scenes from it, and it is considered uh Billy Wilder I apparently said to him when he met him that your movies were 10 years ahead of their time, and he corrected him and said 20. uh and uh but Stroheim was a really interesting casting for Rommel because he was known for being insanely intense on the set of movies, and like that he was like kind of a dictator on the set and he would scream at people. There's a real famous clip of him yelling at a giant a scene of a bunch of actors where they were complaining about the conditions for a battle scene they were filming, and he said, "I'm making this movie for theaters, not for actors." um and was famous for being like kind of over the top and intense, and that he had all these intense battles with Hollywood and at the time. And so when he got tired and fed up of making movies, he became a character actor, and he often played villains um, in movies. And so for it was a big deal for him to be um, playing Rommel, and that was pretty big casting, and it was big deal. you know, for Paramount and Billy Wilder to land him. This movie was filmed mostly on the lot at Paramount Studios in Hollywood. All the exteriors were filmed in the Salton Sea and at an Army desert camp. So, like for example, the tanks are incorrect, and they made do with what they had. I didn't really scream to me like I'm not knowledgeable enough to have watched the scenes. I mean, like, hey, that's a U.S. tank or whatever. But regardless, this was all filmed in Arizona and California, which is, very typical for Hollywood. Um, so yeah, your first initial thoughts on watching this movie, Dave? Five Graves to Cairo. What was your first thought?
I mean, I enjoyed it. Uh, I thought, as far as I've actually seen a few different World War II propaganda movies from the US, and some of them are there. A lot of them are corny as hell, as you'd imagine. But
Yeah.
something like this is actually pretty good. Like, I mean, they took again. I don't have any. I don't assume anything about it is really that true to the experience of the North Africa campaign.
Right.
Um, but I mean, as an entertaining sort of you know, limited location thriller that ties into the war that was ongoing. I mean, it's apparently what they made it right after Rommel's defeat, so it's sort of like a fictionalized version of the like espionage around that. Um,
Yeah.
I'm assuming like is how they played it, but it's actually really good. And again, it's one of those things with like, um, I'm always impressed when I watch a movie from the 30s or 40s. We usually think of like action and stunts often not being very impressive or like things being kind of corny, but there's some moments in there that were really good that I think stand out compared to a lot of other, like the opening where it's a derelict tank driving through the desert and you realize the crew is dead. Something in the middle of a battle, the tank was still running, but everybody got killed except for one guy who ends up being the protagonist. But like him waking up in the middle of this tank, just rambling through the desert, all of
Right.
his crewmates dead, was actually really good, really kind of intense and like surprising. It was a really cool way to start the movie to like pull in like, oh god, this guy's in a bad situation.
Right. Right.
Really awesome like tension right from the beginning.
Yeah. And
Maybe
by the way, we're
yeah.
gonna spoil. And I guess I should have said this ahead of time.
Oh,
Is
that's
that
true.
we can spoil because here's the other thing too: is if you have not seen these movies, I'm going to be promoting the idea that to try and tell people to watch these movies before
True.
but some
Okay.
people will but that's on them. We're going to talk about it. So
These
yeah,
are
that opening
these
scene
movies
is
are all both well over half a century old. So
right.
I mean,
Yeah, you can't spoil a movie from the 40s at this point. So you had plenty of time to see it. So yeah, this opening scene with the tank is great. It's there's some parts of it that look a little dated, but that's you have to
mhm,
expect that when you're watching a movie from the 40s, and
yeah.
yeah, you can't complain about that. But yes, it's a very harrowing scene, and if you think about the idea of how intense it would be to wake up in the middle of a tank, like
Surrounded by your dead comrades and no, not even near the battlefield where it started. I'm assuming. Like we don't know how long he's been unconscious, but there's no signs of battle or other vehicles or anything. They're just wandering the desert in a derelict tank.
yeah,
Um, that would be scary as hell, especially this era. Um, it being as huge as it is. But no, it's cool. And like, yeah, so from there stumbles into a small town, into this hotel that takes him in. But I don't know how we want to do this, just sort of like
yeah, yeah. We can get
telling
into
the
the
story.
plot.
But
Yeah. So when
um,
he wanders into this hotel and finds where the British had been there as colonialists, right?
well, I think
And
it's sort of the idea is it was a forward operating base for at least part of the British military had been based in this small town in the
fighting
desert.
Rommel, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and his forces, and that in their escape, our main protagonist, British character, kind of shows up there and has to assume the identity of Davros, who was the waiter who uh, had died in when the was
Is it
the Germans that
Germans?
bombed,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
was it?
I think it's the Germans bombed the town, and as they were coming in, the British retreat, and so it's like they bombed the town right before coming in themselves. That's the impression I got, but it was like the night before or something. There'd been bombing, and
Yeah,
this guy had been killed. Yeah.
yeah, and convenient for reasons of plot, Davros was a double agent. Uh,
Yes.
he was feeding information to the Nazis, and so, but they had never seen him. So our British character can pretend to be Davros, and the Nazis will trust him, but don't know, didn't know who he was to
Yeah.
a certain degree. And then this sets up, of course, the tension of the people who run the hotel. There's an American, or was she supposed to be
I thought
Brit?
she was supposed to be German or French. I think she's French, right? Because she is because they call her Moosh, and she talks about her brother who she's a French woman who's mad at the British because her brother had fought at Dunkirk, had been fighting the Nazis, and had not been evacuated, and so he's being held by the Germans in a concentration camp as a POW.
Right.
Yeah,
And her motivation is that she wants to get a deal from the Germans to get her brothers released.
yeah,
And so she's not interested in who wins the war. She's interested in saving her brother.
yeah, and like I said, she also actively blames the British for abandoning him. So she's already kind of hostile to this new guy um, when he
Right.
shows up.
Right. Which sets up and creates the situation with those two, Mooch and our stand-in Davros. I'm Colonel John
I can't remember his
Bramblin.
name when I watched it. You said, okay, Bramblin. All right, yeah,
Bramblin, yeah. Bramblin slash stand-in Davros. Their tension between them. There's the guy, the Egyptian man who runs the hotel, which is
yeah.
frankly the worst part of the movie.
Fareed, yeah, he's mostly just comic relief. He's your typical sort of cowardly, like the cowardly foreigner who's just sort of panicking while all this
Yeah,
stuff goes on around him.
absolutely the worst part of the movie.
Yeah,
Cringy and bad. Um, but so he does a few things that are not terrible, but mostly it's a
like
pretty bad.
it's just dumb comic relief character as far as I could tell. Like we're just supposed to laugh at how incompetent and like scared he is about all of the stuff going on around him. Although also portrayed as fundamentally decent. Like he's the one who decides to save Bramblin when he stumbles into the hotel and passes out, and he
Yeah,
never wavers from like trying to hide him and get him out safely.
yeah.
So there's that.
So that's not totally terrible, but yeah,
Yeah.
there's definitely a part of it for sure. And yeah, so that was, that's kind of the setup. So then the Germans come very quickly in the movie, and they want to use this hotel as their base of operations. And not only did the Germans show up, but uh, among them is Field Marshal Rommel. And it's interesting because if you watch the trailer that they made for this movie in 1943, a huge part of the selling point of the movie was the battle against Rommel. And, like I realized that Rommel was an important historical figure to World War II, but I didn't realize that he was well known enough in the world that Hollywood was selling this movie as the battle against Rommel. And I guess that's my naivety about the time, you know.
I mean,
Uh,
he was the face of the German army in North Africa. Like, I think there's a reason we still know his name today, right? I mean, he became this, and also the fact that like now I am not a military history or military strategy nerd necessarily. So my interest when I talk about liking resistance movements and guerrilla warfare, I was studying social movement organizations and that kind of thing. So
right.
not really from a military perspective. Um, but my understanding, he was a genuinely incredible military commander. Like he just a real strategic mind that, um, which is also, as the leader of the German troops in North Africa and the way he was toying with the Allied forces during the fighting there, um, he became sort of this larger than life figure for a lot of, like, even during the war, right?
And just knowing the backstory that this guy who he got to play Rommel was this hilarious, over the top, like dictatorial film director from
Yeah,
Austria is fascinating. But his performance as Rommel is pretty strong and a pretty intense
yeah.
part of the movie. How did you feel about that performance?
No, I thought it was great. I mean, well, so we talked about this a little bit ahead of time, but so Five Graves, I didn't find out till after I watched it. My wife and I looked it up, and it's one of Quentin Tarantino consistently always listed as one of these movies that was a big influence on him. And I will say Stroheim, I definitely got. It's not the same, but I would not be surprised if Christoph Waltz was told to watch that performance before doing Inglorious Bastards or something. It's different, but the idea of the like mixture of intelligence and charm with this constant undercurrent of like sinister
Yeah,
danger is there the whole time. And like the fact that throughout it he's sort of this mixture of both like a very urbane and polite to everybody around him. He has all these British prisoners of war that they have in tow with them, right? Because they're in the
yeah,
middle of the desert, and so they what else are you gonna do? They're dragging them along with them. And he invites the officers from these British prisoners of war to dinner with him, right? And he sits
yeah,
around and he talks with them, and it's all very friendly. And well, you know what I mean? Like it's this kind of like, I don't know what it'd be like, this honor among fellow warriors kind of attitude that he has. But at the same time, as you can see the like just absolute terror he puts into people when he like turns on a dime and gives an order. Um,
yeah,
yeah, like in particular, there's a point where Moose tries to like get close to him to lobby him about her brother, and he just has none of it. It's just like stand 2 steps away, and just all he will do is just coldly give her commands.
yeah.
And you can just sort of tell that like when this guy decides he's going to use violence or discipline or whatever, it's going to be firm and it's going to be uncompromising. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the more powerful scenes of the movie. It's also a hinge point of the movie because Bramble as Davros being able to hear Rommel um, gloat about how he's winning the war is how he's able
yeah,
to give the information that would lead to Rommel's defeat with this Five Graves concept, which is that um, the idea that Rommel was able to do so well in the war because he didn't need to supply himself because he used these archaeology expeditions in the past to bury supplies in the desert in Egypt before the war, um, as in planning ahead. And so these five graves are where the materials are being held, and if they could find these graves before the end of the battle, they could cut off Rommel's supplies. Is the idea. And so Bramble as Davros has to escape and get the information out. And there's some really good scenes. There's a good
yeah.
action scene where the real life Davros is unearthed by a further bombing scene. What do you think of this scene? Because I thought the scene
Yeah,
was great.
yeah, it was cool. It was really cool. So yeah, I mean that's, I guess, the central tension, right? Is he has all these sort of cryptic references to how Rommel says he will win the war, and so Davros has to not be caught, but also find out what those are. Initially, he wants to kill Rommel, right? And then one of those British officers, they're able to like figure out, like he's sort of able to surreptitiously let the officer know who he is, and the officer's like, no, don't kill him, intelligence. And so that's when he decides to start unraveling like what is he referencing when he talks about, when he's had these references to five graves, this one doctor. And anyway, they all eventually, the British bomb the town because they know the Germans are there, and So they all have to go into the cellar, and that's where Davros, the real one, was buried. Right? They said that part of the building collapsed and he was buried under the rubble, which all sank into the cellar. But that bombing shakes loose some of the rubble, and you see parts of Davros there. And so I can't remember his name because we haven't mentioned also one of the other. I guess you could say like there's the five main protagonists, right? You've got the um, what
The
was his name
German
again?
lieutenant, the
The German
German
lieutenant, right? Who actually is one of the first Germans to show up before Rommel gets there, but and who,
um, it's Schwitzwelger.
yeah, and he
Schwitzwelger.
Schwitzwelger, and he is playing Moosh. He's trying to, he's saying he can help get the word around. He can send some telegraphs, get her brother out, blah blah blah. And it's eventually revealed that he's just playing her, and I'm not sure why, but I think it's the 40s. They won't say openly, but it's pretty clear he's just trying to trick her into sleeping with him. But at least that's how I read it. Um, but he finds the real Davros's body, and so then we get this chase through the abandoned hotel, or the empty hotel, while it's being bombed, where it's landing in as Davros and this guy like chasing each other through this dark building, and it's all lit just with flashlights. And for the fun, this is actually one of those I mentioned, like 1940s. We don't think of action sequences being great, but I think they did a great
Oh, it's
job
so
on this
good.
one. It's so
Yeah.
cool because basically, I mean, it's what a lot of movies with bad CGI want to do today, but but can never seem to pull off. Where it's all in dark rooms, and so just with flashlight movements and sound effects, it's this really great tense fight. And in particular, the ending where the flashlight gets dropped and they just focus on it, and you hear a lot of scuffling and then gunfire. But they
Yeah.
actually pull off
So good.
really well, where it's really unclear like who got what. Really excellent. Like again, it's Billy Wilder, so I mean, next year he does Double Indemnity, which is a suspense classic, right? I mean, the guy knew what he was doing clearly. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. No, and very good. Sorry, Gary's trying to make me distract me. Everyone. But so here's the thing about this scene is it forces the action a little bit where now that this guy, you know, exposes who that he's not really Davros, then he has to kill the lieutenant. But this puts Mooch and Bramble at odds with each other because she was depending upon
yeah,
um, this lieutenant to help her, but Bramble has killed him and hid his body in her room, which is kind of
yeah,
a dick move.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, it's sort of a servant's quarters the two share, but yes, it is
yeah,
very much a dick move. Put it.
yeah. I'm gonna kill this Nazi spy. I'm gonna put him in your bed.
Especially considering there's so much rubble and abandoned rooms around there, you'd think well, I mean, it might be hard to pull off, but still, yeah,
Yeah,
they have options.
still kind of a dick move.
Yeah,
But he does this. There's a great scene of tension between them, and this sets up a kind of a setup and payoff for the final scene when uh, the lieutenant's body is eventually discovered. Um, where, and this is one of the coolest scenes in the movie where Mooch basically um, kind of makes a decision to like she's not going to get her brother, but she can help Bramble get the information to defeat Rommel, and at the last second, in a very tense moment, kind of takes the fall for this. If
yeah,
yeah, and this scene is very tense. And this is where you get the payoff of Rommel, and this is where I think we were wondering why Quentin Tarantino had this movie so high on his list of, it's a good movie, but we were wondering why it's so high on his list of movies that he liked. But I think Quentin loves seeing movies where the tension and suspense is all built on dialogue.
hmm,
And I think that might be one of his influences here is that this whole scene is people talking,
yeah,
and it's incredibly tense. It's incredibly nerve wracking if you get yourself into the position of the characters because she could turn him in. She could
hmm,
have like made a deal for her brothers at that point, and you think she might do that.
Yeah.
but at the last minute she makes the right decision and basically takes the fall. What do you think of this scene? I thought this was made the whole movie in
I
my
thought it was, yeah, I thought it was great. And similarly, yeah, after watching the movie, I was like, okay, I could see Tarantino in this movie. I was seeing Inglourious Bastards and also Hateful Eight. It's a very like limited number of people, bloody mystery in a hotel in the middle of nowhere. Like that's also very Hateful Eight. But the no, I really liked that scene, and I definitely was in suspense about her and how she was going to react to all that. I guess the other angle on this too is that the Germans still, because he killed this lieutenant, no, the Germans still didn't. The other Germans still don't know that he is this British soldier, that he's not this guy Davros, this German spy. So they're going to send him to Cairo to help do more intelligence and lay more groundwork for their advance. And so he's trying to let that happen, and she knows that. And so that, yeah, her taking the fall allows him to go and contribute to the war effort. But also, I really like at the. I guess that leads to a couple of things. I think it's Farid. He gives the weapon to and says, "After I leave, um, he's hiding this pistol that was used in the fight. And he tells Farid, like, after I leave, give them this evidence and say I did it, that I was actually a spy who, blah blah blah, like basically tell the truth about me once I'm gone. To say spare her.
yeah.
So you get a lot of like sort of the whole movie is a lot of cat and mouse shenanigans, but especially at the end you get a lot of that. And he does make it back to Cairo, tell the British about the five graves where all these munitions are hidden, um, and helps cure this, helps the war effort. And we get this sort of montage of like him working in a tank, loading or whatever, and sort of the idea of the British taking back. And when they finally get back to town, after what 5 minutes or something of like this kind of general war footage that I'm assuming was like them filming soldiers training in the desert in SoCal or something, but you know, uh, something like that. But oh, and also he decides to buy a parasol for her while he's in Cairo because I don't. It was funny. I will say at the end, it's a big deal about the parasol. I don't remember them talking about it,
I
but
don't remember them talking. I had the same thought,
yeah.
like did we miss the scene where the parasol was
Or maybe she did mention it and he, whatever, and it just I wasn't paying as close attention to that as a scene. But like, you
yeah.
know, um,
And one of the I do think that the I did read that they did use some stock footage of like one of the actual battles
oh, okay.
from, and that they when they wrote the movie they didn't know that they would be able to get access to it, and like when they
Mm.
first started production, I think Rommel hadn't quite been defeated yet, so like
Oh
they
wow.
had
Okay.
to. I mean, this was like ripped from the headlines type
I was gonna say,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. I'm
Yeah,
hedging their bets the whole way. Yeah,
yeah,
what right. I mean the fact that Rommel was defeated in 43, the movie came out the same year, so
yeah.
um yeah.
It's pretty intense that it happened that way. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty crazy. Um, yeah. So like now that we've kind of gotten through it, before.
Well, there's one other big thing, right? Because he
Oh
gets
yeah,
back
yeah,
to
yeah,
town. He gets back to town, he finds Farid, who's still running the hotel, still was able to stay alive. British set up their headquarters there again. But then he finds out that Moosh, they killed her. And basically, what's the reasoning was, well, she was found not guilty of kill. They actually did a court martial for her, and she was found not guilty of killing this German soldier, but that she had denounced the was it denouncing the state or something, because she basically just kept saying you will lose, like during the trial she just went off on them, and so they killed her for political reasons essentially. um and so he ends up, so yeah, Blanding ends up, leaving the parasol on her grave, and that's more or less where the movie ends. But
yeah, and a pretty powerful ending because also Mooch in the beginning doesn't really like care about what's happening. She only cares about her brothers and
it's
like
it's a
and
it's a move common in a lot of these movies. It reminds me of like it's a gender reversed Casablanca kind of thing, where
mhm.
she's the morally ambiguous character who ultimately decides to join the cause. Um, you know, I
Right.
always think
I
of
hadn't thought about that, that
It's
Casablanca.
Humphrey Bogart. I mean, and there's also To Have and Have Not, which was set in Martinique during World War II, and similar and same thing, Bogey and Bacall. Not as good as Casablanca, obviously not as famous, but also very good still. But yeah, that kind of that kind of element is often the core in some of these movies, like that loyalty, the which side are you on kind of element. And she gets to be that character in this movie.
Right. Well, and I think overall, especially for the era, I think this movie holds up pretty well.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and it's sad to me that it's kind of a lost movie. I don't, I'm a huge fan of World War II fiction. Obviously, I wrote a book for it, but it's one that I don't hear much talk about, and especially in the canon of Billy Wilder movies, it's almost
yeah.
never, you know. Uh,
Well, I mean, it's a quickie propaganda movie, right? I mean, it's a
yeah,
very good one, but it's not like not as groundbreaking as the a lot of the other stuff he ended up working on, or as subtle, or I, I get it. Like this is a well-made, straightforward thriller versus
mm-hmm.
something like The Apartment. I don't know, which is a really like intense sort of comedy drama that
Yeah,
is really touching and really subtle about like you know, these characters, about love, about I don't know, even like work
yeah.
relations and stuff like
It,
that. In a way that this one isn't. It's a very straightforward war thriller, right? A spy thriller, more
yeah,
or less. Yeah,
and as well as these two movies are connected in the sense that they're related to 1943, um, they're so different in the sense of you know, they're complete opposites in the sense of, and this is, quite a segue here I'm building, but,
sure.
the Army of Shadows does not romanticize the resistance
No, not at
at
all.
all.
In any way.
Whereas Five Graves is definitely a propaganda film. It's meant to make
Yeah,
you feel good about the war effort and what's going on. And,
yeah,
which, I'm
yeah.
not
Like they put it.
totally
It has
opposed
the
to in the sense of that the world was fighting fascism at the time
yeah,
and Nazism. However, that being said, making movies that kind of glorify the war effort and don't um, you know I wouldn't say that this movie completely avoids the horrors of war
sure.
altogether.
Again,
But
that opening in the tank and like it's interesting watching these movies the way they talk about concentration camps, for example. Like,
yeah,
and admittedly, this is before the liberating of the actual death camps, but everyone understood that Nazis treated their prisoners horribly, right?
yeah,
That it was
that
that they
was
were
interesting to me. I did
brutal
notice
and
that
ruthless.
too.
Yeah, like you didn't have to say a lot more for people to get that, like, ooh, that's bad.
Yeah,
And also the fact that Moosh dies, even though with that turn where she ends up supporting the resistance, and I think that's also it was during the war. Everybody was familiar, like it is a war. People, there are casualties, people die, and so the movie wasn't shying away from like having a hero get killed at the end, and that even if despite our best efforts, right, that people we love might die in the war effort, right? Um, but it is still, like you said, yeah, I agree with you. It is very much still trying to keep you optimistic about the chances of winning the war and how we're turning the tide. Whereas Army of Shadows is 25 years later and dealing with survivor guilt and with the also the questions of the moral ambiguities that war puts before you. And
mm-hmm.
yeah,
Well, and I can't remember the name of the other screenwriter, but Billy Wilder's screenwriting partner on this movie said that, you know, when he watched it, that it smelled too much of propaganda to him in the end, and
mm,
that they were constantly in a battle with like what are ways they could dull the feeling of propaganda. So I think they
sure,
were very acutely aware that
yeah,
the studio wanted a propaganda movie and they were trying to do what they could to
yeah,
not make it feel quite so over the top on the propaganda
yeah,
scale. But yeah, that's that's the the way it was. Anything else you want to say before we move on to Army of Shadows, and maybe you
Yeah.
and I'll take a break real quick.
I
Uh,
mean, I don't know. I'm not sure what I would say beyond. I mean, it's good. Like I said, as much as we're saying it is World War II, I'll be the first person out there that propaganda isn't necessarily always a bad word for me.
yeah,
Um, and but it just means that you watch with a certain eye and understand that they're going to be saying certain things for certain reasons, right? And sometimes they can be propaganda for a good cause. And I think this is a good example of that. Like, it's trying to keep people excited and motivated to fight the Nazis, and it's done with a pretty
hey,
intelligent, engaging story. Yeah,
sounds familiar.
exactly. Um, so and so if you like a little tight, kind of stagey, closed room type, suspense thriller story sounds interesting set during in the North Africa campaign sounds interesting to you, definitely worth checking out, especially because it's like an hour and a half long and you can watch it for free.
Yes, and yes, I definitely recommend the experience if somebody just wanted to hear us talk about it. I think they definitely missed out. They should see it. Five Graves to Cairo is a hard movie to find, except for it's
Yeah.
on the Internet Archive. So, and if you don't know the Internet Archive, people should discover it because one of the things it does, for example, like for in my purposes, I use it all the time because a lot of the old science fiction pulps are digitized on the Internet Archive.
Yeah.
um and so you can find, like, if you want to find an amazing stories from 1943, it's likely on there. And So that's where I watch Five Graves. I think you might be able to rent it on YouTube.
I
I
don't think
know
so.
Army of
I didn't
Shadows, I rented
I
on
didn't
YouTube.
I
So
did not find Five Graves on YouTube. The only place I was having the hardest time until you sent me that Internet Archive link.
yeah.
But yeah, that's up and totally free. So,
Yep.
um,
So no excuses. People can watch that.
yeah.
And then, all right. All right. So after that amazing segue, we're going to talk about our second film, Army of Shadows, the 1969 French Italian co production that didn't get released in the United States until I think it was 2006 or seven.
Yeah, it was 2006.
Yeah. Um, Made by French director Jean-Pierre Melville, who we're going to talk a lot about him. My first introduction to his work was as a Hong Kong action movie fan,
Yeah.
being told that The Killer was basically a remake of a French movie called Les Samurai, which was his. And so the first Melville movie I saw was like kind of being confused, trying to see why it was considered the source material, although they're similar in a lot of
I
ways.
was gonna say the plots are almost are
Exactly the
are
same.
super
Yeah.
close. The style is radically different from the killer, but the
That's,
plot is almost
yeah.
the same.
The plot is the same.
Yeah.
And so definitely I did not dislike it. I just was like, okay,
Yeah.
this is,
The
I
other
expected like a French movie with like some kind of two-gunned guy sliding down
right.
staircases and
I
stuff.
was I was aware that the killer had been based off of it, but I actually never got around to watching La Samurai until I heard it was one of the big inspirations on Ghost Dog, the Jim Jarmusch movie. Um,
Right.
and that is a much closer comparison, although Ghost Dog is also a bit more like Melville. He's sort of got a reputation as crime, making gangster or crime movies, because that's what his most famous stuff mostly was. And instead of like action or suspense, I always feel like his movies it's almost like existentialist cool, like is the mode they're in a lot of the
Yeah.
time. um these movies about sort of stoic men of action doing dangerous things.
And for all I know, he may have been a stoic man of action, because
Yes.
this movie is a very, even though it's based on a novel, it's based on a novel by Joseph Kessel. Um, um, and although not a very faithful adaptation from what I can gather, and that John Pierre Melville used the setup of the novel to kind of rewrite it into somewhat of his personal experience of being a part of the French Resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And but his experience and Kessel's apparently were not too dissimilar in that
Yeah.
regard. Um, but what I know of the book is from reading some very intense reviews of it. I could not find the book in English translation except for very expensive editions.
Mm.
So if I ever find a library copy of it, I will probably read it, or if I find a cheap copy at some point. Um, however, I do know I will at some point point out some things that are different.
Mm.
Um, however, the book is very important because the book is kind of a first like person narrative look at being a part of the French Resistance. As I said earlier, it's the first time a story about the French Resistance like got out to the world. It was
Mm.
originally published in Algiers and in the States in 1943, but it was, of course, banned in France at the time and did not like become released there until after the war for obvious reasons. Um, and Melville and his brother were both heavily involved in the resistance. And from what I could tell, they had to escape by, at one point, by hiking into Spain. And his brother was taking money for de Gaulle to England and was robbed and murdered in the attempt, which is pretty intense. Um, so Melville came, that was his pseudonym in the war. He chose it because of the director, um, Melville, and he
It was author Herman Melville. Like,
author Herman
yeah.
Melville. Sorry, and then it became his stage name like after the war, which is fairly interesting. Um, and Joseph Kessel, who wrote the original novel, is got all kinds of medals and stuff after the war for his efforts. He went on to write many more novels after the war and wrote a really fantastic movie called Night of the Generals. Have you seen Night of the
Mhm.
Generals? Night of the
No,
Generals is great. It's about it's a I think Donald Pleasance is in it. If my I saw it so long ago, but
sure.
and that's about some German officers who get accused of rape, and the French trying to put these German officers on trial like during the occupation.
Mm.
Very good stuff. Have not seen it in a long time. This is telling me I need to revisit that. Um, but he wrote that movie. That was an original. That was his one original screenplay.
Okay.
But yeah, that's our setup. So, what's your history with Army of Shadows? You said you. Oh wait, we went through that. You saw it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The okay. So, but this time seeing it, what's your first thoughts after watching it again?
Yeah, I mean, I still, it's kind of like when people talk about spy novels. I remember maybe this will be convoluted and too specific to my personal experience, but I remember um in graduate school
Go for
studying
it.
history of foreign relations in a class on that, and we had one about spies and spycraft. It was U.S. foreign relations specifically, and I remember there were all these essays talking about how difficult it is to do the history of espionage for reasons you can probably imagine. And one of the articles I remember saying that like from what they've it was a scholar of espionage and of U.S. intelligence services saying we have these ideas, romantic ideas of what spycraft and things are, but I think the best, probably the most accurate representations are what you find in John le Carre novels, where it's these kind of little quiet bureaucrats who are half con man, like
Mm,
constantly tricking and each other, and not necessarily a lot of action. And like this similarly like has that verisimilitude of like when you read any number of like people who've been involved in clandestine resistance movements, their memoirs, a lot of it you get is about just the constant tension. and the constant it's not exciting necessarily. It is and it isn't, right? Because no, hold on. Yeah, hopefully the sirens are past there.
Hey, Chicago.
Well, we're really close to where a huge concentration of hospitals are, so we get a lot of ambulances going by, and
Ah,
we're on a
gotcha.
major street that goes up to like several of the major hospitals. So,
We get
um,
motorcycles because we
oh,
have biker bars down the street from us.
oh, we get motorcycles at night because the kids drive their motorcycles around. But anyway, but to get back to this, so it's a similar sort of thing. It is a story of the French Resistance, but it's a story of a lot of people being very quietly sneaking around in pretty mundane um, locations, right? Um,
Right. Well,
it's
one of the complaints about this movie is that some people accuse it of being like talky and boring. And that is just mind boggling to me because I think it's people not paying attention to what's actually happening in the story
well,
because they're used to
yeah,
Hollywood movies where things go boom all the time.
exactly.
And the specter of death and torture hangs over every scene of this
Yes.
movie.
Yes, and the movie reminds you there are multiple times where characters, several of the different major characters are captured, tortured. They never quite show the torture scenes, but they show you the aftermaths a lot of the time. Yeah, and same thing. Like, yeah, the movie trusts you to understand the stakes of doing clandestine resistance against a Nazi occupation. Like, it's not going to hold your hand to say these people are risking their and their family. I mean, everyone's actually, no, I shouldn't say they aren't going to hold your hand because there's at least one point where they really explicitly lay this out, but that like you're risking your life, all of your loved ones, all of your family, um, that any screw up. And also, it's interesting. The 43 thing's interesting because it's my understanding from my reading on this is this very much was a period where the French resistance was small and largely focused on espionage, right? They were doing
Right.
intelligence gathering, maybe some small acts of sabotage, occasionally trying to liberate prisoners. But this is prior to actual, this isn't like armed guerrilla action per se.
Yeah,
Um,
that in the Maquis movement, what kind of happened more
yeah,
when the Germans started trying to draft them to build munitions.
exactly.
Right. That was the mistake that the Germans made with the French because that sent everybody out into the woods to start fighting. From
Yeah.
what I could, again, just like from my reading of the history, I
It's also at the
obviously
point,
was not there. So
it's also the point where the war is starting to, the tide is clearly starting to turn, or may not clearly, but it's appearing to, right? Because you have the successful North Africa campaign. East don't never discount the Eastern Front, right? The Stalingrad siege fails,
yeah,
which is arguably the most important battle of the war, at least in that theater in Europe. Um, and the invasion of Sicily and then Italy begins. So that also really helps sort of up the amount of like outright warfare. But this is before that. This is just small groups of people sneaking around, you know.
in
And yeah,
occupied France. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I guess it does expect you to. I mean, it's a very mature story, right? This isn't a movie with like exciting heroes, and the heroes themselves, the main protagonist is this kind of stocky middle-aged man in glasses who says very little and has just this stoic look on his face the whole time. He's not a hero. By the way, I don't know if we've mentioned this yet in the recording, but I've heard people I know you brought up, and I've heard it as well. The comparisons to Andor, people saying Star Wars Andor
yeah,
um, plays a lot like this.
we
Boy,
did
oh
talk
boy,
about that in the recording. Yeah,
Skarsgård's character is to me. I was like, oh, this guy Gerbier, whatever, the main protagonist felt like Skarsgård's character. He's the central organizer who seems to just be like this quiet middle-aged middle class man,
right,
unassuming, whatever. And he's the guy with his fingers in every pot. Like he knows where everybody is. He's constantly, making the decision to, early on they have to assassinate one of their comrades who's turned people in, right? He's the one who's
right,
making that decision and holding the line, being like, no, we can't. This guy has already led to multiple deaths and tortures. We can't let him survive, right?
right.
Um,
And Andor as a character is a something that happens in Star Wars that kind of makes the war and the fascism more real than anything else
Yeah.
in the saga when he kills an informant in Rogue One.
Right.
And this is something that is ugly. It's not a romantic view of the rebels, and in the same sense, this is that's the comparison to Army of Shadows. I
Yeah.
think is
Exactly.
because they do ugly things. It's not a pretty view. And by the way, this movie did not had bad timing on its
Yep.
release in France and was not a very popular movie because a lot of people saw it as very pro De Gaulle,
Yeah.
and De Gaulle was not having a good moment
Yeah.
in the
Yeah,
end
the
of the 60s.
protagonist is pretty openly De Gaullist. They go, there's a brief period where the a couple of the fighters end up back in London. They meet with the Gaullist leadership, the Free French leadership. Um, which isn't to say, like, I mean, as was really the case in the French Resistance as well, it wasn't just De Gaullist. Like one of the guys he works with is a communist, right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was bad timing in 69 because it was De Gaulle who put down this 68 student movement. And so he was seen very much as like the face of conservative France at that point.
And
Um,
it was thought that that hurt the box office for this movie in France.
oh, I'm sure.
Um,
It
and
certainly it hurt the reviews when it came out because a
Yeah,
lot of those, especially the most famous film critics of the time, tended to be pretty explicitly left wing. Um, so
absolutely.
yeah.
And one of the major differences between the novel and the book is that Melville chose in the film to not focus on the politics of the characters.
Hmm.
You almost don't, it's almost hard to miss sometimes who's the communist, who's the
Yeah,
De
I mean, it's just
Gaullist, who's
it's
what.
mentioned in passing, but in the context of the work they're doing, stuff doesn't really matter,
The
right?
political ideologies apparently are a much bigger part of the novel,
Mm,
and including the scene when they're all facing execution and they share the cigarette. Um,
yeah.
Apparently, in the book, that scene they all declare like they have the scene in the book is a very intense discussion of where each person's ideology lands.
Okay.
So, which sounds like a cool scene, and another reason that made me want to read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, but yeah, so that was part of the reason why the reception of the movie wasn't like super super great. I think in hindsight, when we can get away from like the kind of history of that, we can kind of look at the movie more on its own terms. Of we're not as invested in hating De Gaulle right now. Uh,
Right.
and so, but my personal feeling is that you know, yeah, it's not a shoot 'em up movie, although there's a few scenes like that. There's the escape from the first arrest, uh, and um, there are scenes. There's a scene where the Nazis make everyone run in front of the Gatling guns and all that. And so there
Yeah.
are shoot 'em up scenes, but that's not what this movie's about. This movie is
Yeah.
about the tension, the fear, and the unromantic view of resistance movements in general.
Hmm.
Is I think what drives this movie. It's a spy movie set in World War II with the French Resistance in a very grown up way.
Yeah.
Um, and but as somebody has studied like these movements, like what did you think about the way that the movements operated in this movie? Because I
Yeah.
thought um I really liked how ugly things got. Like that felt realistic to me. I don't.
Yeah. And I would say also like the play of loyalties, the ways that betrayal happened, that's all absolutely true, right? The way that they different people have leverage used against them once they're captured, that kind of stuff. And yeah, when you get into these kind of violent struggle, like that kind of forces your hand, it kind of forces all elements then right down that path. So a disagreement, what might be a disagreement in one area, like when it comes down to someone handing people over to be tortured, then they go, well, yes, this might be a comrade I've worked with for a long time, I may even personally like, but he's a threat to my life, other comrades' life, the movement. We've got to kill him, right? I mean, that kind of stuff. And I guess one of the things I liked though also is I think I mentioned like, and people have brought this up about it, that there's elements of like almost survivor guilt to this, which I think people have made this contrast between the movie and the novel it's based on, because the novel was written during the war. And again, like one of the things I read is that it apparently generally comes off as a little more hopeful. Um,
Yeah.
and this one, we all know how things eventually work out, right? And so it allows a little bit more room to play with to try to start dealing with some of the moral compromises and the ethical quandaries and the like personal and psychological and like emotional toll it takes on these people, right? Like that all of them, it again, they're very stoic. It's the kind of movie you just sort of have to watch and pay attention to the looks on faces, the occasional sort of slip where someone says something. I will say one point, it kind of plays its hand towards the end where and by the way, it's we could give a plot synopsis, but it really is sort of just episodic, like this following this guy, again, was it Gerbier, I think is his name, um, through a period of what, maybe a year or so. Um, and so it's just sort of from one event to the next as he goes around sort of trying to do this clandestine organizing. And towards the end, he mentioned that he's able to escape a firing squad with some help from other resistance, comrades, and they put him up in a house and basically leave him alone for a month. Like it's an ostensibly abandoned house in the country, and to make sure that he's safely out, no one knows where he is, no one connects him to the other members of the resistance, whatever. He's left alone in this house with like four dense philosophy books and a bunch of food.
Yeah.
And so we get his voiceover as he's filling out, like he's they show him like writing a diary and whatever. And so that kind of plays his hand a little bit, where he talks, you get a sense of the toll all this takes on him, right? And really playing out the like, yeah, sure, you can think about how you would try to live that double life, right, as a resistance fighter, but it really does come through how on edge they are, both in terms of like their lives, but also their mentalities, like their emotional state. Again, if you're paying close attention to it,
Yeah.
uh,
That
it
scene
really
too,
comes
like
through.
you get the idea that he doesn't know how long he's going to be there. He
Yeah,
doesn't know, and there's a lot of like,
like
you know,
they all know death is right around the corner. Like
yeah.
that's one of those things that comes clear throughout the movie. Like at a certain point, I mean, honestly, the most interesting character in that sense for me, more so, is it's the only female resistance fighter, this woman Mathilde, who everybody just speaks so highly of this woman. Apparently, just
Right.
a Parisian housewife who has incredible skill at disguise, acting, whatever. She's an incredible intelligence gatherer, an incredible planner. She's the one who plans this escape from the firing squad. She tries to plan another escape that nearly succeeds, where she pretends to be a Nazi nurse and goes into the middle of a military hospital to get a guy out, and it's only thwarted because the doctors won't release him because he's dying anyway. Um,
Right.
and so like she's incredible, and but again, it's also very clear that like she knows her death could come at any moment, and like that's sort of the ultimate climax of the movie, is when she gets captured. And they sort of play this all out. Like there's this whole conversation about how they have to kill her because once she gets released, it's clear that like the Nazis are trying to use her as an informant. um and again, it's one of those things where they just sort of game it all out, and they're like, you know what, she would want us to do that, and then they go and make sure she knows who's killing her, and she just accepts it. But it's really intense, and it's a silent scene when that happens, right? um but like that's sort of the point. It's like these people they're living on this edge the whole time, right? Where they're up against this incredibly brutal power, and to be able to resist it at all means they also have to compromise themselves. um Maybe not the same level of
Right.
brutality, right? Like they're not going out and killing the whole families of people who are who betray them or something. They're not setting up concentration camps. So it's not to put it on an equivalent layer to the Nazis they're resisting, but they do have to compromise themselves, and that's sort of a huge chunk of it is like living that life of both, death is constantly around the corner, and I maybe, myself, um, you know, dirtying myself in so many ways. Again,
Right.
thinking about it, for those of you who found it after Andor, that seems to me to be the real connection.
Yeah, and
Um,
there's also with the people who found it after Andor, there's the whole there's the whole part where Andor is that where he's waiting for the heist on that planet.
mhm,
There's also that connection. It's clear to me that Gilroy was influenced by. That's why I think
yeah,
I think when Jacob made that comparison on film Twitter, I think that's one of the reasons why it was actually apropos because it seemed like
yeah,
Gilroy was influenced by Army of Shadows. It
yeah.
really does.
No,
Um,
like I said, there's direct characters. Like in particular, Skarsgård's character is basically Guerrier. Like,
yeah,
and he explicitly says right at certain points, some of the points I was making that come through here about the moral compromises he's had to make and the things he's sacrificing, or potentially sacrificing for this cause.
yeah, that speech that he gives in Skarsgård's character gives in Andor, like you could put it in Army of Shadows, and
Yeah,
it would it wouldn't miss a
exactly.
beat. So Army of Shadows, one of the things that makes that movie so good is that, like you said, and also another comparison to Andor is that it is episodic in the sense of it's a long movie, but it has different parts that like kind of make up episodes of what's happening,
Hmm.
and you certainly could have extended and blown out this story into like a TV series over like 10 episodes or whatever if you had the time, but it's all done very well in the movie, and the movie does a really good job of telling a tense story that never really kind of loses its steam. That is, if
Yeah.
you're paying attention a lot. Like, and we keep saying that because I think a lot of people will find this movie to be boring, and it's on
No,
that.
there's not a lot happens in some ways. Like
Yeah,
by the standard, again, compare to contrast with something like Andor, right?
right.
Um, right? Like, admittedly, people talk about the sort of saggy first three episodes of Andor, although I think they do a good job of sort of setting up the stakes and the relationships,
Agreed.
that kind of stuff. But I also agree that it doesn't actually get really riveting till maybe the fourth episode. But like the one contrast I would make with any Star Wars or most Hollywood movies, right, is that it isn't playing like there is a climax, there is a moral catharsis of a sort, but it is not necessarily satisfying. It is
Right.
not like, like it's grim as shit, right?
Yeah,
Like I said, probably if there's a character who's there, it's not a movie that is allows for a cool badass the way Star Wars would, right? Or most
yeah,
exciting war movies. But if there is one, it's probably Mathilde again, who is not an action person. You never see her pull a gun or even run, I think, but
yeah,
she's constantly pulling off this incredible stuff for the movement, and the movement itself kills her at the end, right? And then we get immediately after that we get cards explaining how everybody else got captured and killed
yeah.
within a
No,
year. Like, it
yeah.
is
It doesn't.
grim. It
And
is a
that's
grim movie, and
yeah,
it is not a satisfying, cathartic, like, yay, we won. There's no dancing in the Parisian streets at the end. Even another of my favorite urban guerrilla movies of all time, Battle of Algiers, does have a heroic, triumphant ending, even if all the protagonists are dead at that point. They don't do it.
yeah,
Army of Shadows is not that. It is just this story of that. In some ways it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. One of the criticisms apparently got at the time, beyond the Gaullism thing, is people saying that it was Melville telling the Resistance story as if it was one of his gangster movies. And I think that's an interesting comparison too, because these are not unlike a lot of movies about criminals. These are people who are, they're living day to day. They're hustling in some
yeah,
ways. They're hustling and spinning plates, and they know that they can't keep it up forever. Now, it's different in that they're doing it for a cause instead of just sort of opportunistic, you know, wealth or something. but it is a similar sort of thing, and I think that's partially why he could tell the story the way he did, because he had some experience telling stories of that kind of life.
Yeah. And just as a film, it looks very good. It was a first time cinematographer, apparently,
Mhm.
fresh out of film school. The movie is framed very well. It's very well made. So, um, and what I think is one of the things that about its grimness is that it makes it like a different experience. It makes it a very different experience from watching most movies. And there's a feeling of Melville's experience comes across in the film. Like you can
Mhm.
tell that somebody um, had this experience and didn't want to flinch about telling it. I mean, do
Yeah.
you feel that way? I feel like you can feel his experience in every minute.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Although apparently I read that some people, including folks who worked on the movie, were questioned his service in the actual resistance. He definitely served in the Free French Army. Um, Once they actually were, post D-Day, apparently he was actually in the military. But whether how there's some question about how much he actually was in sort of clandestine stuff before that, but it very much did feel like, or if not his, then yes, the experiences of folks he knew. Well, I guess we do know for certain, right, that he did at least do a little bit of like trying to sneak resources to the Gaullist government and things like that.
Yeah. And
um
we know his brother died in the process of doing that.
yeah, exactly, so he definitely had intimate experience precisely with this kind of stuff, and I agree. I think it's I, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it certainly seems like a way of telling this story that I can't imagine someone who didn't directly experience it this way would come up with. Um, to tell it as this kind of constant low boil tension. Um, Again, without any action, without, well, I don't say any action set pieces. You could argue the escape from the firing squad potentially, but although it's
And when
very
they
short.
the first arrest when he escaped
Oh
by
yeah, that's true. The first escape is actually, which is actually pretty awesome, pretty badass. Dude
yeah.
just stabs this Nazi guard in the throat, just unflinching in a second, just up, boom, knife in the throat, and then he's running. Pretty amazing. But like,
And
they're
he
very,
knows the guy escaping with him is not going to make it, and he's
yeah,
just like
yeah,
he
yeah, exactly,
basically lets uses that guy to get out.
yeah.
You know,
And so, it's there's a little bit of that, and also it doesn't have the spy movie. There is secrets being dropped off and plans being made, but it's not your sort of usual, like, we must get X MacGuffin to save the world or something. Like, none of that kind of stuff. It is just sort of the mundane moment to moment, um, which again strikes me as it's not unlike a lot of stories you read, both from like resistance movements, but also like any kind of war situation, right? This weird mixture of boredom and tension, um, right? Where you're waiting for the big thing to happen at the same time as most of the time it's not happening, right? So
yeah, I watched a Q&A with some historians talking about this movie, and one of the things they said was that they felt like in some ways this movie downplays the effect that the French resistance had because it was too early to show like the major impacts that the French resistance had towards the end of the war, but at the same time, that had to do with like how early in the war it took place.
yeah, I
Um,
would also argue, I guess that's one angle. If you're from the perspective of like a certain kind of military or political history, I get maybe making that criticism. Like for me, again, my background was sort of what they call social or cultural history, and looking at social movements on that level, something like this, that's again, it feels like trying to get at the experience of the rank and file resistance member. Um, this seems like a really powerful sort of testament to that. Again, not necessarily as somebody who's an expert on the French resistance specifically, but having read an awful lot about a lot of different guerrilla, read and watched and whatever, a lot about a lot of different guerrilla movements. Like, again, this really strikes me as similar to a lot of the stories you hear about these, like, that that constant tension, that constant
Right.
sort of, again, a little bit like a gangster story, a little bit like a war story. Um,
But I
the
think it's
skills
one of
of,
the better Resistance movies. I mean,
yeah.
outside of, I mean, I'm kind of only half joking about like V being one of the best, but
I mean, I would argue Battle of Algiers.
Battle of Algiers for sure, and then
Um, yeah,
what's
I don't
some
know. I mean, maybe State of Siege. You ever seen that one? It's Costa Gavras movie about some Tupamaros, the Uruguayan guerrillas, kidnapped an American ambassador in the early 70s. But that's a really, really good one. Um, Classic sort of 1970s movie, political sort of post 60s movie about guerrilla resistance against dictatorship. Um, from the same director as Z, to give you a sense of the sort of where that's coming from. But yeah, there's not a lot of great one.
no.
There's
And you and
definitely,
I
and
went to a
everybody,
Q&A for Soderbergh's Che, which was
it's just that's a decent one, and it's interesting because when they do make them, they're always calling back to Battle of Algiers or Army of Shadows, right? Depending on how action packed you want to make it.
right.
Um,
Well, that's
um,
true, and I remember Soderbergh referencing Battle of Algiers, but
yeah.
Army of Shadows wasn't really on my radar at the time. But
I don't think you would with Che's story. He was not involved in that kind of work.
yeah,
It just wouldn't fit.
yeah,
I mean, maybe a little bit around certain things, but no, he was very much the like organizing in the countryside, something closer to what you think of as like guerrilla warfare as class. Well, in fact, yeah, he is. His experience is what we think of when we think of classic guerrilla warfare, right? Small arm band you know, doing tactical raids on a
well,
superior force kind of thing.
yeah. And so one of the things about Army of Shadows too, I think that makes it such a I mean, I think the non-romantic view of the resistance is actually really part of its strongest foundations, because if the movie had like kind of a propaganda feel to it of
Yeah.
like, yay, rah, look at the French resistance, it wouldn't be the same thing,
Yes.
because it wouldn't have that tension that hangs over every minute of it, you know.
Yeah, and in fact, when bringing up Battle of Algiers, similar sort of thing happened where I remember reading once where the director was Italian, Gillo Pontecorvo, and he was hired by the Algerian government shortly after the revolution, right, to make this movie. And apparently they clashed, and both visions they had initially sounded terrible. Where Pontecorvo wanted to do one about a European journalist who comes and sort of learns about the war and decides that he's going to support the Algerian independence movement. It's a very white saviory kind of thing, or reminds me of a lot of other cringy movies. Think of something like Cry Freedom, where let's do a movie about Stephen Biko, where half of it is about the white guy he made friends with trying to escape. Stuff like that. And then the Algerian government just wanted to make a rah rah rah, yay, hooray, we won our independence against the bad empire. And um, in the compromise, they ended up producing something much more real, something much more
Absolutely.
intense and serious. And similarly, like I think Melville's tendency to focus on that kind of the procedural element of just living in the resistance really helps. And if it had been a heroic spy or action story, it probably wouldn't be have been as controversial at the time and probably wouldn't be as well remembered now, right?
Right. And it's interesting with the Battle of Algiers. It seems like maybe they could have just done a Franz Fauna biopic or whatever.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean,
Just a
he was an
thought.
important intellectual. He was an important intellectual figure, but not necessarily a leader in the actual revolutionary movement.
That's
But
true. That's true.
and whereas they
Um,
actually got leaders in the revolutionary movement to act in the movie, so
that's
uh,
true. Yeah. And
yeah.
if people haven't seen Battle of Algiers, it is one of the greatest movies ever made. So
It's a good companion piece again for these kind of the rare movies that have this kind of unvarnished view of resistance movements and guerrilla warfare. That isn't necessarily unsympathetic to them either, though, right? It's not demonizing the resistance movements, but it's also not pretending like this is, you know, this is unproblematic heroic resistance, right?
Sorry, I had the flashing Philip K. Dick for a moment.
It's okay. I can flash mine real quick.
There you go. Um, well, so just to kind of wrap things up, I think Army of Shadows is, it's a really powerful movie. I think it's one of the best movies of the conflict. That it's super underrated as far as a World War II movie goes, because it's and maybe it doesn't get thought of that way because there's no battles, there's no like front lines, there's no, but it's of the era of the time. So I
Mm-hmm.
personally think it's one of the best, most tense movies
Yeah.
of the era.
And especially, I would say also, like, as somebody of that generation, as somebody who actually fought in the war, right? Um, he actually served in the resistance. Like, not that there weren't filmmakers who served and did some very good movies based off of their experience, but it's it's an interesting one because of that sort of ambivalence about it and the way, the darkness of it, to come from somebody who actually, describing his own experiences and or his families and whatever, with the war. And as somebody also, again, he was a Gaullist. Well, I don't know if he was in. Well, I mean, I guess if he served the Free French, although the Free French Army was anybody who was anti-fascist was, willing to sign up for it. But regardless of his personal politics, he was explicitly anti-Nazi, personally put his life on the line for the cause, but is also willing to like unpack and wrestle with, you know, his that experience and the range of it, not just the heroism. Um, so, and I don't know. There's got to be a few other world movies about World War II from World War II veterans that do that, but there's not a lot, right? Um,
Not like this movie.
no, yeah,
Sorry, my mute button was playing havoc with me there. All right, so to Army of Shadows is a really fantastic World War II movie. So just my
yeah,
last thoughts on it are that it is underrated. It's a movie that can be studied and thought about um, very deeply. There's a lot to be said under the surface. It's one you can watch multiple times and get different
oh, yeah.
levels out of. Do you have any final thoughts on Army of Shadows?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would call it underrated necessarily because when it got its revival in the mid 2000s, people were like saying, 2006, there were people saying it was the best foreign language film released in the US. It's like, at that point, it was 37 years old. Um, so it took a long time to get a
Sure.
reevaluation. It was underappreciated in its time, definitely. Um, and yeah, again, especially, I would imagine somebody interested in the kind of stuff that you write, um, if they're serious about the politics, something like Army of Shadows is worth your time, right? Um, and even if it is slow burn, it's quiet, it's subtle. I mean, I don't think it's subtle, but it's subtle compared to what you might expect from film a lot of the time,
Yeah.
and certainly going to be more subtle than your novel. But
Yes. Yes. Those comparisons are not good.
no, but anyway, but the other thing also is like Melville, if nothing else, like watch it to appreciate. Like the guy's an incredible filmmaker. Everything he does has this sense of style and cool. Even this kind of dark meditation on um on the experience of the French Resistance. Like, dude, he was, a lot of people have even argued that he may have sort of been the original French New Wave director and just no one called him that, because he was doing this incredibly like innovative filmmaking. And like I said, if you would all like that kind of the French mid 20th century existentialist cool, like this movie drips with it. As long with also being again slow, dark, depressing in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, but boy, you can also bask in just these like stoic, intelligent people, all very well dressed, sort of like carefully doing their work. If you can get down with that, maybe if you watch another Melville movie, you watch like Le Samurai or Cercle Rouge or something, and you like how he handles gangster stories, you will definitely like this.
Right. And I will say that there is some spycraft and some like scenes in The Last Night to Kill Nazis where double agents are dealt with and so on and so forth. So
Mhm.
there are some similar moments, but with vampires. So well, a vampire. And you know, and yes, I admit, like a lot of the motivation was, wouldn't it be fun to watch a vampire kill a whole bunch of Nazis? And the part of the inspiration for that was we had a synagogue shooting here in San Diego not too recently, a few years ago in Poway. So writing something that kind of deals with anti-Semitism was something that appealed to me, and to my Jewish publishers too. So at Clash Books. So we had a lot of fun doing that. So um, I'd say Army of Shadows is in the vein of, I don't think the movie hates, well, the movie hates Nazis for sure.
Yes, no, the
Um,
Nazis. There, it is unambiguous that the Nazis are just yeah are a horrific terror, right? I mean, they are
right.
just an all-encompassing. Yeah, they are a totalitarian terroristic force throughout the movie. Like it is
Yeah.
unambiguous about that. Yeah.
And one of my favorite things about the new Indiana Jones movie is it definitely hates Nazis. And I should note that the prologue to the new Indiana Jones movie takes place the same night as my book. So
All right.
that there
Now,
is that.
by the way, we didn't mention this on Five Graves, but the fact that it's about Nazi archaeologists may have had me wondering, like, did Spielberg see this when he was a kid? Like,
Cameron Crowe was quoted as saying that that it had to be an influence on Raiders of the Lost Ark in
I
some way.
mean, it wasn't the only thing with, the German archaeologists were big for a long time, and the Nazis never hid their interest in occult and esoteric nonsense. So it's
Yeah,
not like you couldn't have come up with it independently, but like the fact that it is a story about that it hinges on German archaeologists doing work in Egypt, right? Nazi archaeologists doing work in Egypt is like, I don't know, seemed like
yeah,
there
it
had to
is
be
an
something there.
interesting thing. Well, and that's one of the things that if Last Night does well, um, on sale now from Clash Books, pre-order now. Um, if it does well, I would love to have Noah like fighting Nazis with various monsters throughout the
Yeah,
backdrop of World War II, even though we know how it ends on the on the
sure.
last day. But also yeah, because I mean he's an OSS agent. There's lots of things and monsters that he could be finding all over the war theater.
Hmm.
So plenty of opportunity there if it does well. But I love the idea that uh, I know that the whole Nazi occult thing has been blown up, but it makes so much fun for storytelling.
Oh
So
yeah, sure.
you can do that. So on that note, so you guys all have to, people out there have to buy a lot of copies of The Last Night to Kill Nazis if my Army of Shadows style prequel with the French Resistance and Noah is ever to happen. So just know that it's on all y'all
Hmm.
to get out there and get The Last Night to Kill Nazis. But and yeah, and so I think at the end I'm doing an okay job of getting the word out there about this.
Sure.
That's the whole point. So if you made it this far, congrats to you, folks listening. You're a true World War II movie nerd. I believe the next episode of this particular mini series, we will be covering A Bridge Too Far and a little bit pulpier one in Paratroop Command. But it may be the Dirty Dozen. We haven't done the Dirty Dozen yet,
Mm.
so I got to do the.
No, that's a classic run around and kill lots of Nazis movie.
Oh, and Cross of Iron is coming up. We're gonna do Cross of Iron.
Oh,
Peckinpah.
interesting. That I haven't actually seen that. It's one of the Peckinpah movies I haven't seen.
Yeah. So those are all movies that are coming up. So if you made it this far and you want to get ahead of me and watch that, we'll continue to do a few of these episodes after the book comes out. And then the last thing that I have to announce that is the Southern California book tour in September 14th through the 17th with Cody Goodfellow promoting his techno thriller Vertical and John Shirley promoting his military sci-fi novel Suborbital 7, which is about kicking Putin's Russia's ass. So to themed with the Nazi theme. But he's got a lot of beating up on Russia, I guess, in his book, from what I hear.
Okay.
John and I had an argument last year because he did an action series that got turned into a Stallone movie called The Specialist under the name John Cutter in the 80s. And he
Okay.
recently did a John Cutter novel where he fought neo-Nazis. And we actually had an argument who killed more Nazis in our book over pizza. So, and I know for a fact I kill at least 160 Nazis in this book. So,
Okay.
at least 160. So, on that note, folks, thanks for listening. Dave, do you want anyone to find you on social media or no?
Not really. I don't do much on social media that anybody would find interesting.
Right.
So I'm barely active in where I am. It's in very private places with people who know me well.
Sure.
So I mean, I could talk about my own work, but I don't know this crowd would be that interested.
Well, you're archivist,
A
librarian.
librarian, but
Yeah.
yes, not an archivist. Although, yeah. So I don't know. If you got an interest in indigenous Mesoamerican languages, I'm helping lead a project putting together a database of documentation of different indigenous languages. And I've got a co-edited book about independent publishing in Latin America coming out this fall, but not, yes, as you can see, very different from the subject matter here.
It's okay. There's a story. I was with my dad at a bookstore one time, and I found a copy of one of my books on the shelf, and signed it. And then he had to tell the cashier. He had to say something about it, and he said, "My son's books are under horror. Mine are under sleeping aids." Uh,
Yeah,
Pretty
yeah,
funny joke.
yeah, yeah. That sounds about
Yeah.
right.
So on that note, Dave Woken, thank you for joining me on the podcast and bringing your
Yeah.
intense knowledge to these two films. I think this will be a highlight in the series. And for everyone else, the next episode of Postcards from a Dying World. Well, no, we just see it's cool. We've had an astronomer on. We had a guy who does a heavy metal talk show and this. So fun stuff on the podcast.
Academic librarian, I think is the easiest way to describe it. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you again next time.